Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third ARRP seminar. Today's topic will be on ethical decision-making. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their continuing cultures and connections to the land and waters of New South Wales. So welcome, everyone. And you're in for a treat today because ARRP has curated an amazing seminar on ethical decision-making, commencing with a discussion on ethical issues in general, then moving to ethical issues with respect from the point of view of a scientist, and then finally, ethical issues with respect to Category C members. You can submit your questions as we go through the seminars, and please do them by the questions and answer tab. And we'll try and answer as many questions as we can at the end of the three seminars. However, chances are that we're not going to be able to deal with all of them. And for the questions that we don't answer today, we'll circulate a question and answer document following the webinar. Please note that this seminar is being recorded. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Jane Johnson from Macquarie University. Jane is an ARRP Future Fellow in the Department of Philosophy and the Centre for Agency, Values and Ethics at Macquarie University. Her research employs the tools of field philosophy to address ethical and epistemological questions in science and medicine. Current projects include understanding the role of medical device representatives in Australian hospitals and improving the practice of biomedical research with animals. Jane's research is driven by a commitment to the vulnerable and to research that enhances lives. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction, Sophie, and thanks so much also for the opportunity to present as part of this session about ethical decision-making in animal research. So I will just share my screen there. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Okay, so like Sophie, I want to begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I am currently working as part of Macquarie University, and Macquarie University stands on the lands of the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation. I'm currently, however, working on Gadigal country. Now I'm just trying to move my screen to being able to move through my slides. So there we go. Okay. So I'm structuring today's discussion around a number of key questions. So I want to start out by thinking about the best way to harness the value of animal ethics committees. And I'm going to suggest two ways of doing this: by developing a good culture around animal ethics committee operations, and also by trying to build the skills of those people who both submit to animal ethics committees and are also on the panels. And part of how I'm going to suggest that we build skills is by thinking about different principles that might be able to support good decision making. I do, however, want to begin with an acknowledgement that animal ethics committees and animal researchers diverge tremendously. So a lot of you may actually be doing and employing some of the skills and tactics that I'm going to talk through today. So I commend you if you're already doing that, and I hope you'll find it productive and perhaps consider sharing the kind of things that are really working well for your committees. So I want to start out, as I said, by thinking about what makes a good culture in animal ethics committees, because this is really important. In particular, I think Category C and D members of committees, and we'll hear from a Category C member in a moment, are really important to the good functioning of animal ethics committees. And they also play an important role in substantiating the social license, which upholds the public's perception that animal ethics is and animal research is being undertaken appropriately. And one of our speakers will also touch on that issue of social license in a moment. Something that I also think is really important is that categories C and D members have a potential to ask questions that are a bit outside the box sometimes. And this is the case with people often who work outside of a particular area or a discipline. They can come in and sometimes have insight into questions and problems that people working within that discipline have maybe stopped asking or haven't considered. So I think even though sometimes it can be taxing and frustrating potentially to engage with some of these questions, they are actually really important to ask, those questions that really challenge us to justify what we do and why we do it. Part of the concern here is that some of the research that's been undertaken about animal ethics committees has shown that these members may not always feel that they can appropriately participate and contribute fully to the committee. And this is for a few reasons. Sometimes they feel they don't necessarily have the same expertise as other people on the panel, that they may be intimidated by the kind of structure and hierarchy that operates within committees. But as I said, it's really important to ensure these members do contribute, and good chairs can actually ensure that this happens and can help support a culture in which these members fully contribute. So chairs should be looking for opportunities to make sure that contributions for these members are invited. Perhaps consider asking them to be the first respondent when a new protocol is discussed, or when wrapping up a discussion of a protocol, ensure that those members have had a chance to have their views heard. It's also really important to ensure that the participants, all members of the committee, are appropriately and respectfully listened to and their views engaged with. And so to be very careful not to be patronising sometimes of these members, which can be an issue. So that's part of what can help make a really good functioning AEC. But I also want to talk about these issues about building researcher and AEC skills. So doing ethics isn't a kind of a tick box exercise, even though sometimes when we fill out ethics applications, it can feel a bit like we're being driven to think of it in that way. Actually, doing good ethics requires thinking carefully and thoughtfully on what we have done in the past, what our values are, and how we can take those into the future. And it requires a level of engagement as well with our own views and the views of others. So ethical deliberation and judgment are actually skills that we can help foster and develop through training and practice. They're not necessarily just things that we know how to do. We actually have to attempt to cultivate ethical practice. And coming along to a webinar such as this one, I would suggest, is a good way of being actively engaged and helping improve your ethical reflection. Another way of improving how we might do ethics as researchers and people who sit on committees is to potentially employ tools, frameworks, and principles to help us in our ethical reflection. And I want to touch today on two different kinds of sets of principles. So the first, of course, is the 3 R's, which everyone will be familiar with who works in the space around animal ethics. So to replace, reduce, and refine the use of animals in research. Now, the work of Russell and Birch on developing the 3 R's is now over 60 years old. It's come under challenge and pressure in certain kinds of ways. And these two researchers that I want to talk about in a moment, Tom Beecham and David de Grazia, have tried to build on the work of Russell and Birch and come up with principles that may be more applicable in the environment we find ourselves in 60 years after they initially set forth these principles. Also, what Beecham and de Grazia do in their book is also try to give a more explicit grounding for the kind of ethical principles that we might use when we deliberate within animal ethics committees. So I want to take the remainder of the session to talk through the values that Beecham and de Grazia articulate in their book, and also the principles that they articulate to support those values. Now, they talk about two different values being the kind of values around which most people can agree that we ought to predicate animal research on. And the first of these values is a value to do with social benefit. So animal research ought to deliver on a social benefit. And they talk through these three principles to support that particular value of social benefit. So the first principle is one that we're all probably very familiar with, the idea of having no alternative method. So we only use animal research when there's no other acceptable way to address the particular question that is being investigated. Their second principle is a principle of expected net benefit. So the idea that the benefit that will accrue from the research is meant to be over and above any potential costs. So costs in this principle in particular to human beings. The costs and risks to humans need to be less than the potential benefit that will come out of the research. And this can also include the kind of costs and risks to humans that might come from animal research that doesn't necessarily translate well to humans, and so might risk harms to humans who are part of clinical trials. So there's increasing recognition of some of the limitations of animal research, and this needs to be, rather than ignored, it needs to actually be factored into our attempts to grapple with the ethics of animal research. And the third principle is really a principle that seeks to uphold and acknowledge that in doing research, we are potentially harming sentient beings, non-human animals who have that capacity for sentience. And so we need to ensure that the research is significant enough, it's substantial enough to warrant that kind of harm to animals. It's important that these principles be actually clearly demonstrated in protocols, explicitly engaged with, this is according to Beecham and de Grazia, so that they can be evaluated, discussed, deliberated on by animal ethics committees. So I'll turn now to the second value that seeks to be supported here by principles, and that is a value of animal welfare. And I'm talking through these principles because I think these are principles that have a capacity to, as I said earlier, address some of the worries that have accrued around the 3Rs, and I think they will increasingly be influential in animal research. So the principles here to support the value of animal welfare, in the first instance, a principle of no unnecessary harm. So harm actually needs to be absolutely central to the scientific question being addressed, but also morally justified by that question. So it has to live up to those principles that I talked about a moment ago to do with substantiating a social benefit from research. The second principle here is a principle of basic needs. So the needs of animals in research need to be addressed, not just as part of the protocols themselves, but also in the transport of animals and in the housing of animals. So even animals in research have a a reasonable, or ought to have a reasonable expectation that they can have a minimally decent quality of life. So their basic needs ought to be met. And those needs aren't just needs for shelter and food and water, but they might, in the case of social animals, include access to conspecifics and so on. So a generous idea of what basic needs involves are important there. And finally, and potentially the most contentious of the principles articulated here, is a principle to do with setting an upper limit to harm. And this, of course, needs to be discussed within various committees and other bodies to determine what that actually looks like. But there have been moves in some jurisdictions, so in the European Union and other places, to move away from and eliminate protocols where it is expected that animals will endure severe and long-lasting suffering. So a principle to do with setting that kind of upper limit to the harms that might be expected to be experienced by animals in research. Now, as we all know, good animal welfare supports good science. And so it's really important, if we're going to continue the practice of animal research and do so with appropriate social license, that we make sure that we deliver on these values to do with social benefit as well as animal welfare. So thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss those points, and I look forward to a discussion at the end with some questions there. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Johnson. A fabulous introduction into the topic of ethical issues in scientific experimentation, and a lovely introduction also to the two presentations that will follow. So thank you for that. So it gives me pleasure now to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Tony Rowe. And Dr. Rowe is a veterinarian and an animal welfare officer at CSIRO. He has a PhD in immunology and is a member, by examination, of the Chapter of Medicine and Management of Laboratory Animals of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists. Previously, he was the manager of an animal facility which held mice, rats, and rabbits, and was a researcher working in areas such as toxicology, oncology, and parasitology. Although it's not written in his bio, I actually saw Dr. Rowe speak at the recent ANSCART conference, and he was so impressive, we invited him to speak here. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Sophie. I will share my screen now. And okay. Thanks, Sophie, and thanks to ARRP for the offer to present. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and paying respect to elders past and present. Ethical decision-making encompasses a wide variety of purposes and situations. This presentation will focus on the requirements placed on animal ethics committees by the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes. I will start by considering the framework which the Code provides for ethical decision-making. The remainder of the presentation will discuss examples of ethical dilemmas such as adverse impacts, humane interventions, collection of voucher specimens, and reducing animal numbers without invalidating experimental results. The superscript numbers throughout the presentation are references to the Code. Respect for animals must underpin all decisions and actions involving the care and use of animals for scientific purposes. This respect is demonstrated by the governing principles of the Code. AEC members must declare in advance any interest that could influence the objectivity of their decision making and remove themselves when decisions are made on matters relating to any perceived or actual conflict of interest. AEC decisions should be based on a thorough, fair and inclusive process of discussion and deliberation and should be made only by those present throughout the discussion. Decisions should be made on the basis of consensus and, if necessary, only resort to majority decision after exploring ways to modify projects to reach consensus. The AEC must clearly communicate its decisions with reasons and any conditions attached to an approval in writing as promptly as possible. And the broad membership of an AEC represents community standards, and AEC approval grants the animal user social licence, which is the societal expectations placed on an organisation in return for community support. Most non-observational projects have adverse impacts on the animals involved. These are described in an animal ethics application so the AEC can balance the potential effects on the well-being of animals against the potential benefits of the project. The Grimace scale is an example of work which adversely impacted a group of animals but improved the welfare of many more. The chart on the right is the Grimace scale for mice. These are species-specific pain-mediated facial expressions involving the eyes, nose, cheeks, ears and whiskers. It has 5 facial expressions, which are scored from 0 to 2 in order of increasing pain and distress. Grimace scales now exist for at least 10 different mammalian species, including horses, pigs and ferrets. These provide a method of monitoring animal well-being which is more immediate than objective measures such as change in body weight or food consumption, and more effective than subjective methods such as appearance and demeanour. The list on the left of this slide includes some of the methods used to create the mouse Grimace scale, such as injection of noxious substances and physical injury. In addition to the facial expressions, responses included licking, biting, shaking and withdrawal. In many cases, identical or highly similar insults are known to be painful in humans. So although animal experiments should avoid or minimise harm to animals, this is an example where a committee decided the obvious harm caused was outweighed by the benefits of the work. The most extreme adverse impact is death as an endpoint. This severely impacts animal well-being, so requires ministerial approval in Victoria and New South Wales and is tightly controlled in other jurisdictions. Death as an endpoint only occurs when death is the deliberate outcome of the scientific activity and the animal will not be humanely killed before death occurs. It does not include death of an animal by natural causes or accidents, or the planned humane killing of an animal in a project or because of the condition of the animal. Death as an endpoint must be avoided unless it is essential for the scientific aim. Examples include investigation of life-saving treatments, cancer research, investigation of environmental contaminants, and lethal vertebrate pest control agents. These projects must be designed to minimise the number of animals that will die and must be replaced with early experimental and humane endpoints whenever possible. In the case of projects testing the efficacy of lethal vertebrate pest control agents, it can be difficult to determine whether death as an endpoint is the correct category of procedure if the monitoring plan aims to identify and humanely kill moribund animals. Some animals may be humanely killed, but some will still die as intended by the experimental treatment. Early interventions are both good animal welfare and good science. They minimise the duration and extent of pain and distress and reduce non-specific systemic effects, all of which are experimental variables. Where a project will cause pain and distress, investigators must identify appropriate endpoints for the species and the nature and time course of the predicted effects. Experimental endpoints are the earliest time point at which data can be obtained and the study completed. Intervention points are when actions are necessary to minimise pain and distress. Humane endpoints are when an animal should be humanely killed, regardless of whether the aims of the study have been achieved. The table on the right lists some humane endpoints in cancer research, which includes criteria for eating and drinking, loss of body weight, and impaired ambulation. A voucher specimen is a preserved specimen that serves as a verifiable and permanent record of wildlife. Collection of voucher specimens frequently concerns AEC members because destructive sampling seems to be the opposite of conservation. When animals are collected as voucher specimens, the number taken must be the minimum required for identification or to establish distribution. Specimens must be appropriately documented and lodged with an institution that manages a publicly accessible reference collection. Possible alternatives to voucher specimens include tissue samples, digital photography, sound recordings, tracking devices, and environmental DNA. However, voucher specimens are essential for some purposes, such as taxonomy, because species cannot be properly studied or conserved unless they are accurately recognised and differentiated. Other important studies with voucher specimens include anatomy and biology, genetic diversity, ecology by studying gut contents and surface debris like pollens, determining changes in species distributions over time, and managing public health by identifying parasites and diseases. Access to voucher specimens also allows us technological advances to ask new questions and to re-examine old questions in greater depth. Along with replacement and refinement, reduction is one of the 3 R's. Reduction means obtaining comparable levels of information from the use of fewer animals or obtaining more information from the same number of animals. The number of animals used in a project must be the minimum necessary to achieve the proposed aims and to satisfy good statistical design. Hence, decisions about reducing the number of animals required should be statistically based. The use of too few animals may invalidate results and cause wastage of animals. One statistically valid way to reduce animal numbers is to reduce variability. This increases the power of an experiment to detect effects likely to be of biological importance. Common sources of non-experimental variability include subclinical infections, which are the most common type in laboratory animals, genetic drift, which cannot be stopped, it can only be managed, and variations in microbiome. Experimental variability can only be determined from the literature or from a pilot study. If a pilot study estimates lower variability than expected, it may be valid to reduce the number of animals used in the subsequent full-scale trials. Pilot studies also enable assessment of the feasibility of a project and the potential for refinement. A statistically invalid way to reduce animal numbers is pseudoreplication. This is the use of inferential statistics to test for treatment effects using data from experiments where either treatments are not replicated or replicates are not statistically independent. Pseudoreplication overestimates sample sizes, artificially reduces p-values, and produces false positive results. For individual animals to be statistically independent, treatments must be randomly and independently applied to individual animals, so treatment errors are averaged out across experimental groups. Otherwise, the unit of statistical analysis should be the entity which was randomly and independently assigned to the treatment conditions, such as the litter, cage, holding pen, fish tank, or pasture. Examples of pseudoreplication are counting rodents within the same cage as replicates when treatments such as diets were applied per cage, or counting cattle grazing the same pasture as replicates when treatments were applied per pasture. So in summary, the code provides a framework to guide ethical decisions which are based on respect for animals. When assessing projects, animal ethics committees balance the potential adverse effects on the well-being of animals against the potential benefits of the project. The broad composition of an AEC enables consent for animal use that would pass the scrutiny of most of the public. Investigators must minimise harm to animals used for scientific purposes with early interventions wherever possible, and any interventions or modifications to a project to improve animal welfare and reduce animal use must be scientifically valid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, for that informative presentation, Dr. Rowe. What I found particularly interesting in that was that Dr. Rowe stressed the importance of ethical decision-making to scientific research and its integrity. But he also mentioned in his presentation the need to ensure that researchers demonstrate respect for animals, which is a good segue into our third speaker, who is Tara Ward. Tara is the co-founder and volunteer managing solicitor with the Animal Defenders Office. The ADO, or the Animal Defenders Office, is a volunteer-run, nationally accredited community legal centre based in Canberra and providing free legal services in all jurisdictions. Tara also has a very long association with the animal protection movement. She's taught animal law at the University of New South Wales since 2008. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that was the first animal law course in New South Wales, wasn't it? So congratulations for that. And Tara's also been a Category C member of a university's Animal Ethics Committee since October 2016, and she's going to share her experiences and give us some tips from a Category C member. So thank you. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I hope that my screen is visible, my slides. So thank you very much, Sophie, and to the Animal Research Review panel for running this seminar or webinar, and for having me today. And just a shout out to the owl on my screen. I think I was drawn to that image, apart from being a lovely photo, because sometimes after a 3 or 4 hour long Animal Ethics Committee meeting, that's pretty much how you feel. So to begin, I would like to say that this presentation is coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of country where I am and throughout Australia, and their continuing connection to land, sea, animals and community. I pay my respects to them and their cultures, and to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, as Sophie mentioned, I have been a Category C, or an animal welfare member of an Animal Ethics Committee outside New South Wales since late 2016. I'm nominated by, as Sophie mentioned, an animal law community legal centre, for which I volunteer as the managing solicitor. I have no scientific training, so I'm very much a lay member of the committee. In terms of my own ethical approach to animal research, I am in favour of phasing it out on animal welfare grounds, but I'm also aware that this is not going to happen overnight. I feel that I need to acknowledge this ethical stance for the presentation today, because it does guide my approach to being a Category C member on an Animal Ethics Committee. I should also say, and it was mentioned also earlier in Dr. Johnson's presentation, that this is not a radical or fringe view. Indeed, I'm hopeful that Australia will follow other international jurisdictions in this approach to the use of animals for medical research. So, for example, in terms of legal reform, in 2021, the European Parliament voted to accelerate the transition to innovation without the use of animals in research, regulatory testing and education, affirming that, and I quote, European citizens have consistently demonstrated support for an end to the use of animals for scientific purposes, end quote. Also, last year in the US, a bill was introduced in the US Senate to, quote, amend the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act to allow manufacturers and sponsors of a drug to use alternative testing methods to animal testing to investigate the safety and effectiveness of a drug, end quote. Despite my ethical stance, I have found being on an Animal Ethics Committee to be a worthwhile experience, because it is part of the animal research regulatory framework that we have now in Australia. And because by being on an Animal Ethics Committee, I hope I might be able to make even a small difference to the lives of some animals. It also allows me to develop and improve my understanding of the current regulatory framework. I also must say that I am very impressed with how seriously my past and present fellow Animal Ethics Committee members take their ethical responsibilities. there is no doubt that as much as I may want to criticise the system, the Animal Ethics Committee takes animal welfare very seriously. It is not lip service. It might be frustratingly micro for my purposes, for example, debating at length about different needle sizes to use to perform a procedure on an animal, which of course is no doubt very important from a technical and welfare perspective, or frustratingly welfarist, for example, debating which is the better way to put animals down, whereas I would be questioning whether they need to be put down at all. But it is very clear that such consideration is driven by a commitment to the ethical principles underpinning the Animal Research Code of Practice. Our Animal Ethics Committee is also very fortunate to be supported by extremely committed and professional home institution veterinarians. I'm continually impressed by how they put the animal's needs first, as much as can be within the animal research paradigm, even in the face of sometimes strong resistance from the users of the animals. As a lay member of the committee, I often need to rely on the professional and expert judgment of the vets on what is in the best interests of the animal's welfare. And certainly my role as a Category C member would be much harder if I couldn't rely on the expertise of the institution's vets and their commitment to animal welfare. So for me, what have been some of the main challenges as a Category C member tasked with making ethical decisions about the use of animals for research? One of the main issues is the seemingly entrenched nature of animal use for medical research and the perceived lack of momentum to change this from within the industry. While this issue is far bigger than something I or an individual Category C member could resolve, I have over the years tried to work out how I can deal with it. Basically, my goal is to keep honing my ability to be able to judge what issues to try to tackle, as opposed to those that would not lead to an improvement for animals in the foreseeable future or during my term on the committee. For example, I suggest that there would be no point in raising ethical objections to the use of animals for research per se, and Animal Ethics Committee is simply the wrong forum for that. But what I try to do is to focus on the issues within the animal research framework that I think may lead to improvements, whether for one animal or 10 or 100. And the key tool in this is, of course, the Code of Practice. As we've been hearing today, it sets out the ethical framework in which animal ethics committees operate. Some of the code's governing principles are more or less met by the industry, but there is much in the code that is still aspirational. So there is room within that framework for improvement. And that's where I see a role for me as a Category C member and being able to contribute to the committee's ethical decision making. One of the issues I have tried to deal with recently is wastage. That is, breeding animals in numbers in excess of need, who are not used for research and then killed. Although I've been on an animal ethics committee for 6 years, I think it is now, the number of animals bred then killed without being used continues to concern me deeply. On one occasion, I was reviewing a protocol where it was estimated that a particularly high number of animals would be bred but potentially not used and therefore culled. I was aware that this was standard practice, but nonetheless, I suggested to the committee that in our comments to the animal user, the committee could note the high level of wastage of animal lives and that we look forward to this being reduced in the future as per the principles in the code. I saw this as a way of acknowledging the present obstacles in reducing wastage, but nonetheless to remind the animal users of the obligations of all of us under the code and of the need to implement its governing principles. Unfortunately, however, on this occasion, my suggested observation to the animal users was interpreted by the committee as being a request that the animal users actually do something to reduce the current numbers, and my comment was refused as not being productive. In a further frustrating move, in response to my suggested observation, our research institution then proposed that the animal users give a presentation to the committee on why such high numbers of animals bred but not used and then killed are so common. To me, this missed the point. Animal Ethics Committee members are well aware of the realities of wastage and why it occurs. So I felt it would have been more in line with our ethical responsibilities under the code to have been given a presentation on industry innovations and initiatives that are being developed or have been implemented to reduce the numbers of animals wasted. To date, we have been given the presentation explaining the status quo, but we have not been offered a presentation on replacement or reduction strategies. So I will suggest this next time the issue arises. Another major issue within the current framework, where as lay members of the committee, we may be able to make a difference, is the fate of animals at the conclusion of a project. As we know, this is dealt with in the code in the part that sets out guidelines for dealing with animals at the conclusion of their use, where it notably states that, quote, opportunities to rehome animals should be considered wherever possible, end quote. I really want to commend the Animal Research Review Panel and New South Wales in general for developing and implementing rehoming guidelines and for the earlier webinar on this issue in this year's series. They are excellent resources and potentially of great assistance to animal ethics committees in other jurisdictions where rehoming has a much lower profile. I am in one of those research institutions where rehoming is almost never considered, despite the emphasis on it in the code. I see this as a cultural issue. It is simply not in the culture of the research institution to consider rehoming animals at the end of their use. At the end of their use in research. So I see my role to try to raise the issue wherever I can as one way, hopefully, to start to change that culture. I raise it in comments to researchers wherever relevant in protocols and in discussions within the committee. I see this as a way to remind animal users and the institution of our ethical responsibilities under the code to consider opportunities to rehome animals wherever possible. I have also volunteered to be on the rehoming working group within the committee and to liaise with rescue organisations in the community if and when animals may start to be rehomed. Finally, I thought I would mention some common issues Category C members may come across when assessing research applications. As members of an animal ethics committee, we are aware that within the current animal research framework, ethical decision-making about the use of animals involves balancing whether the potential effects on the well-being of the animals affected are justified by the potential benefits to humans to be achieved by the research. This is notoriously difficult for Category C and other lay members when dealing with highly technical biomedical research proposals and when project proposers do not adhere to the code's requirement for plain English. I push back on this, and if I can't understand the introductory lay explanations in the proposals, I ask for an explanation in plain English before going on to consider the protocol or approving the protocol. Similarly, some animal users provide inadequate responses to the questions on the application about non-animal alternatives. The responses may be standard generic words or may consist of blanket statements that preclinical trials in animals have to be done, or that the literature has been assessed and alternatives are not available. If I feel that the fundamental principle of replacement hasn't been adequately considered or properly considered as required under the code, I will ask for further details or explanation. I feel that this is an important way to remind all those involved in animal research, including the committee, that replacement is a key principle, and this reflects the concern of many in the community about the use of animals in medical research. Finally, when balancing the putative benefits of the research against the potential harm to animals, the entire proposal may raise concerns. This may occur, for example, with wildlife research proposals, where the research objectives are more easily evaluated by a lay member. I have found that if I have concerns about the overall benefit of a proposal when considered against the significant harm inflicted on either the animals being studied or other animals targeted as part of the research, I make sure my concerns are firmly based on the code and expressed in the language of the code. I'm also realistic in terms of outcomes. While it is unlikely that I would win the argument, I'm of course prepared to explore solutions with the rest of the committee and the researcher, including amending the proposal, perhaps requiring pilot studies, reducing the term of the project, increasing the reporting requirements to the committee, and so on. These measures may in turn allow the committee to evaluate the project sooner and with more data than would otherwise be the case, and to decide whether the ethical concerns have been mitigated, thereby enhancing the committee's capacity to engage in ethical decision-making. These are just some of the ways that I try to contribute to ethical decision-making in line with the governing principles in the code in my capacity as a lay Category C member of an animal ethics committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Tara. A very informative and practical presentation. I think the one thing that really, was underscored for me was the importance of the code and how Category C and D members can refer to the code to be able to get their points of view across. So thank you very much for that. All right, we've got some really fabulous questions coming through, and we're definitely not going to get a chance to answer for all of these to be dealt with at this current seminar. So that we're going to pick just 3 or 4 of them, and then the others will be dealt with through the ARRP site, and you'll be notified about those. So one of the first questions that's come through, and I imagine this would be particularly for Dr. Rowe, seems to be a very technical scientific question. And the question is, do treatments of one organ which has an opposite, for example, a kidney, and using the untreated opposite in the same animal as a control count as a pseudo-replicate? I've seen these used in a couple of papers and was wondering about the specific situations where it is appropriate. Are you able?
Yes, good question. I posted a short reply in the chat. I've given a reference there that does give a detailed discussion. It's Lazic et al. 2018 PLOS Biology. The title of the paper is "What exactly is N in cell culture and animal experiments?" But in short, the question is asking, can you use a one kidney as a experimental unit and the contralateral kidney as a control? And the answer is yes, provided it can be randomly and independently assigned to different conditions. So parts of an animal can be experimental units and therefore not pseudo-replication, provided that you can randomly and independently assign them to different conditions.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rowe. So we have another question here from somebody who is a new Category D member. They are a lay member, therefore. And the question is this: I have been told that a contingency of 10% for the sample size is the generally accepted rule. Is that a valid general assumption? I imagine that would also be for Dr. Rowe. And for the lay people, can you explain what that actually means as well? What do we mean by this contingency?
I'm not quite sure what that's referring to either, but I could, even without being sure, I could generally answer that it's going to come down to the variability of your data. Your sample size is dependent on how much variability you have. The less variability you have, the stronger any signal will be between your treatment and control groups, and then the greater your capacity to identify it and the fewer numbers you'll need. And it also depends on how specific the whatever measurements you're making can be. If as you increase the sensitivity of your measurements, well, then you also increase the capacity to detect a signal.
Great, thank you for that. We've now got a series of questions that are directed to each of the speakers. So what we might do is ask Dr. Johnson, Dr. Rowe, and Tara Ward to answer in turn. So the first question is, how do you think animal ethics committees foster an environment where ethical decision-making is at the forefront of all decisions, especially in the face of, lengthy AEC meetings, 4 hours plus? So Dr. Johnson.
Yes, it's really challenging, isn't it? There's a lot of pressure on committees, and these meetings can be can go on for a long period of time. So I think it is important to remember that it is, after all, a committee convened to discuss ethics and to try and make sure that those deeper questions are still asked, in spite of the kind of various other pressures that might be on the committees. And so I think potentially it's actually quite important to really consider alleviating some of the pressure that committees are under in terms of the number of protocols that they are looking at, because that does mean that often people are you can't appropriately deliberate to the extent that you would like on all issues. But I think it's important to have sessions like this great one that's been developed here through ARRP, but to have opportunities to discuss ethics outside of actually making the decisions about the protocols. So having potentially a day in, or a half-day workshop in which people just have discussions, say, of ethical dilemmas, issues that they've confronted, and use that as a basis to kind of think about some of the kinds of important ethical principles that sometimes might get lost in the kind of imperative to get through a lot of protocols that can be really kind of challenging. So it is hard to keep ethics at the forefront sometimes, and I think, again, category C and D members have an important role to play there in kind of making sure that the committee is focused on their key purpose and doesn't lose sight of that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rowe, any comments?
I think Jane pretty well covered it. I'd just add that the role of the chair to keep everybody focused and to allocate an equal opportunity to each member will maximise the social licence and representation that you get on points of view.
Fabulous. Tara Ward?
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, of course, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Rowe have pretty much covered the field here, but I would just say that part of how our committee operates, and of course it's a work in progress, 6 years down the track, and I think we're still all searching for, the best way to run these very, very long meetings covering some really important issues, of course, but is in the preparation. So we're encouraged to do a lot of preparation, which of course also has an impact because categories C and D members can be voluntary or non-remunerated roles. So time is, of course, an issue. In addition to the long meetings is the preparation. But if you prepare and you sort of work out as a category C member, okay, this is a really important issue for me about this particular protocol, and I am going to raise this first of all with the researchers, and then you assess their response. And if there's still an issue and you feel that you do want to contribute to the time of the meeting, then you just have to be firm and do that. And usually the committee are on board in the sense that it is what you have raised is a concern for other members of the committee as well, and then quite lengthy discussions can follow, but that's just sort of proof that it was a genuine ethical concern to start with. So you've just got to have that old sort of courage of your convictions and push through when you do feel that it is an important sort of ethical issue.
Thank you for that. I think we've got time for another question. And this time I'm going to shift the order around. So we'll let Tara go first, and then Dr. Rowe, and then Dr. Johnson, in that order. So we've heard a lot of good things today, fabulous presentations about what can be done to improve ethical decision making. So if you had to choose just one thing for an AEC to implement to enable better ethical decision making, what would that be, and why would you choose that? So Tara.
Oh, damn, having to go first. Well, look, just off the top of my head, it would be, I think, if I had to pick one thing, and it's probably one thing that sort of annoys me on protocols, it's just this dismissing what I regard as the fundamental ethical issues, the consideration of non-animal alternatives, for example, just protocol after protocol, and this is biomedical research. So sorry, just to sort of, I think I saw a question in the chat about that distinction between wildlife research proposals and biomedical research proposals. I must say, as a Category C member, I always breathe a sigh of relief when the protocol that I open is a wildlife research one rather than biomedical. So in the biomedical research protocols would be and I think I alluded to this in my talk, just the dismissing of that issue, or just giving sort of standard words, you know, sort of a stock phrase that you just put in every application. I think if there could be one thing, it would be actually going further and requiring researchers to really demonstrate that they have actively considered non-human animal alternatives, and how we can go about you know, sort of, if there aren't any, you know, what could be done to try to change that.
Thank you for that. Dr. Johnson.
Thanks. I'm sneaking in here as the second speaker. Is that okay? Okay, it's fine with me. Yep. Yeah, I'd actually really support Tara's point there. I think that's something, and part of the issue is that researchers, you know, you work in animal research, so you don't necessarily have the expertise to actually appropriately answer questions about what are good alternatives. The good alternative might be some kind of computer model that you're not familiar with. So I think actually trying to seriously engage with alternatives, and maybe drawing on the expertise of other bodies that are developing repositories of the kind of techniques that can be used to answer questions that we often rely on animals for, might be a way of trying to address that. But I absolutely agree that that's a real issue, and it's something that we could expect a higher standard from, and more engagement, but recognising that it isn't necessarily within the expertise of the research themselves, or even the AEC to actually easily be able to assess that. So we might have to draw in other kinds of expertise.
Thank you for that. And I got the order mixed up. I'm so sorry. Thank you. And Dr. Rowe?
I would say that over time, the same group of people can potentially develop an entrenched line of thinking or view about given protocols, and that I think that continuing education of current members and occasional introduction of new members will bring in a challenge or refresh to a particular point of view, which can result in quite a change in how given protocols will be viewed.
Thank you very much for that. Now, that brings us to the end of our seminar, right on time. We have a great number of other questions that we weren't able to get to. So DPI-ARRP will follow up with these in the coming weeks, and there'll be a recording of the webinar as well as answers to the questions that we didn't get to today. So please keep an eye out for that. Thank you all very, very much for attending, and hope you found it useful and informative. And finally, I think that the 3 seminars we've presented this year have been very successful and very heartening for ARRP. So next year, we're going to be hosting another presentation series, and the format will either be a webinar or a seminar, and further information will be circulated via email in the new year. And thank you once again to our fabulous presenters for giving up their time and sharing their expertise with us. Thank you, everybody. That draws the session to a close.